The winter after the river ran brown and the horses thinned in the valley, Aiyana Red Elk kept vigil over things the world had taught her not to name aloud. She was 38 winters now, old enough to have the lines where laughter and grief both had pressed into her face, young enough that the work of living still mattered like a promise. Her hands, calloused, precise, stained with sage and willow bark, moved through their familiar ritual, boiling water, crushing roots, counting breaths as the poultices took on their proper scent. Steam fogged the window of the cabin she'd rebuilt herself after men with brass buttons had burned her first one, after the ones who'd called themselves government and God had come through like a cleansing wind meant to sweep people and places into nothing. She had been a healer before the world paid attention to her. She learned to read the land the way some read scriptures. Every slope, every creek's change of color, the way the juniper leaned like a listener toward certain winds. She knew bones as if they were open books. She could press fever from a child's cheeks with willow tea. Those skills had sustained her, as had the small inventory of flint, beads, and a few silver pieces she kept beneath a floorboard for days when trade caravans came by and the trader would exchange flour for knowledge. What the world had taken was more than a house. Years ago, a cavalry company, ordered on some ledgered whim by men who did not see the difference between territory and home, had taken her husband and a small son who never grew past the size of a summer moon. They called it a battle. The men in brass called it justice. Finch, Lieutenant Elias Finch, had been on that column, a lean man with iron jaw and a taste for the finality that comes with a loaded rifle. He had spoken to her once, standing too straight for an apology. Apology belonged to the soft, and Finch was not soft. She kept a small silver locket hidden in her medicine bag. Inside, a scrap of cloth smelled faintly of smoke and of the boy's favorite scent, pinon and sun. When winter nights grew long, she would unfasten the latch and hold it until the weight of living again felt possible. That was the life they said she should move on from. The other lifetimes, the one where grief simplified into duty rather than unending ache, were for other women, the ones who could fold and shape themselves to what people expected. Aiyana was not meant to be that woman. She had learned, instead, to make medicine that didn't shiver in a sick child's hands, and treaties that kept bewildered ranchers and her neighbors from stepping across the thin lines between worlds into violence. That morning she heard the knock, hushed, too afraid even to be a knock. It was the kind that braided her old instincts with new danger. It sounded like someone who had nowhere else to go. She pushed aside the curtain and saw a man half-heartedly blending himself into the scrub, a coat too clean in one place and tattered in another, blood dark on his shoulder where the buckram caught the winter light like a bruise. He leaned on a broken rifle as if it were a third arm. He was a gunfighter by the look. Hands like minefields, half a life spent betting on the cruelty of other people's aim. He should have been returned to the men in brass, or left to freeze on the mesa, the calculus of the frontier, a black ledger that liked even numbers. But he was not a passing story. He looked at her with eyes that said he had been broken the same way she had, worn, surprised it was still possible to see. There was a name he offered, a hesitation before he gave it, Cole Mercer. She listened to the way his breath rasped and decided, in the exact moment when choice matters most, that how the world would punish her for helping a stranger did not matter as much as the small, bright fact. He would die if she let him. The door opened. He came inside on 2 feet that shook, and she closed the door behind him like a woman closing a wound. There was a soft sound in him that gave a name to the last thing she'd kept, curiosity about living again. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, laid his hand in hers, and in the silence that followed, as the fire took to the kindling she'd arranged with the precision of a woman who had to economize heat, she made the decision that would set everything else in motion. She would protect him. Aiyana's choice was not dramatic. It was a workmanlike thing, bandaging the wound where the bullet had lodged, setting up a poultice that would draw infection like a confidant draws secrets. Later, she would know what the cavalry wanted of Cole, and how Finch's shadow had fallen over him. For now, all she knew was the weight of the night and the certainty that grief had taught her tools: herbs, patience, cunning. She had been broken by a man in a uniform once. She was not going to be broken by the same shape twice. As she worked, the old wiring of anger coiled under her ribs. She said nothing of Finch. She needn't. The name lived like a bruise on the inside of her teeth. Helping Cole was a hazard. It was also a reclamation. When grief has been a steady companion long enough, acts of care become not capitulation, but defiance. She was the one to decide whom to save, and when she wrapped the rag around the wound and dipped it in her brew, she whispered into the hollow of the cabin as if it were a statement, "I will not be quiet." He met her gaze then, something like a question on his face. She could feel in the narrowing of his eyes a cautious respect that would be earned by every choice they made together from that night forward. She had offered him shelter, and what she took in return, his trust, was more valuable than any coin. Outside, snow would come. Inside, plans, small and careful, took root. She had lost kin to a captain who thought his conscience had been provisioned by law. She would not let a lieutenant like Finch decide the end of everything else she held dear. Cole did not sleep easily. Even with his wound wrapped and the poultice beginning its slow, humming alchemy, the muscle memory of a life lived among gun smoke kept his hands restless and his eyes scouring the window as if men in brass could appear there with the same certainty as dawn. For 3 nights, they moved between medicine and silence. The sort of unspoken pact that forms when 2 people acknowledge survival is shared labor. He learned quickly the rules of the cabin. Shoes off by the hearth, no talk of names that belong to the dead unless you were planting them so they might grow into stories rather than poison. She taught him how to read the weather by the way the juniper bowed. He taught her how to check a rifle without making noise. Their alliance was practical before it became anything warmer. The men in brass were coming in patterns her apprentice mother's stories had prepared her for. Small at first, scouts and riders, then larger when suspicion hardened into pursuit. Cole had been tracked. The cavalry wanted him alive for reasons that frightened him and angered him in equal measure. A captain's ledger said one thing, and Finch believed he held the right kind of law, a right that had meant killing women like Aiyana's husband and boy. Now, the same man wanted to finish what war had not finished, to tidy an old shame into a newer certificate of dominance. Aiyana made a map from memory and earth stains. She explained how the land could be read, how a man familiar with its secrets could bleed without leaving a line of evidence. All the water runs to one place, she told Cole, tracing a finger over the map like a seamstress going over her pattern. The cattle tracks betray themselves at the marsh. And if the wind is from the north, a cigarette's smoke will curve and tell you lies. He listened, an assessment in every tilt of his head. He had been a student of hardened things, gambits and trades, the way a man with nothing uses his hands. Now her hands taught him the other rules: patience, observation, the patience of roots. When the first patrol came, they did not see the cabin. Aiyana had covered her smoke with a stew of pine and willow, masked scent with the same herbs she used to steady a convulsing child. Cole had hidden his rifle in the hollow under the floorboard and moved when it was time, like a man who had practiced vanishing. The patrol circled, dismounted, and called in low voices. From where they stood, Aiyana and Cole were threads in a tapestry of gullies and sagebrush, and the cavalry were wrong to think the land was only theirs. They escaped because they worked as though their lives were craft. Aiyana led them by a game trail she'd used as a girl, an old Apache path that wound where the soil had been trod by women who were wise enough to walk where horses couldn't or wouldn't. She chose to go at dusk, a time the cavalry preferred for its certainty, because dusk gave better cover and the world had a softness at the edges that slowed the judgment of men who liked straight lines. Cole carried the wounded weight of his shoulder on a strap she had wrapped to distribute strain. She tightened it without asking for thanks. He watched, sometimes with the candor of a man who had no small talk left, sometimes with humor that lay in his mouth like a saved coin. "Why help me?" he asked once, as they crawled through a shallow creek beneath a careless moon. She could have said, "Because we're the same shade of grief." She could have kept silent and let the question hang and be answered by the night. Instead, she let an unvarnished truth fall. "Because I keep people who are alive," she said. "I don't let the world tally them in fewer numbers than there are." He nodded, his jaw working as if he had to move his mouth around the answer to make it human. He had been a man who believed he could do without fixes, until a woman reminded him how necessary they were. The exchange made him more cautious about saying things that would make her burden heavier, and it made him more faithful in small matters. He would scout, he would listen to the wind in the valley. She would patch and plan. Neither of them would be a passive instrument to the other. They survived the first engagement by staying inside another world. The cavalry didn't know. She had a medicine field where feverish children rested during summer, and a woman's network along the river where gossip circulated like a map. She called the network by its practical name when she wrote letters: women who ran boarding houses, midwives who took in those who'd been burned from earlier skirmishes, a trader's wife who would leave a pack of beef at the edge of town as payment for a favor. Cole learned the way women operated: soft, decisive, invisible only by design. And the deeper he paid attention, the more he respected the methods that had kept communities together when men in uniform thought they'd done the necessary clearing. At one stop, a midwife named Maria Lopez let them hide beneath her larder, told them with no fuss that men in brass moved by ledger and appetite and would pass when the trail was misread. Maria's hands were steady. She offered Aiyana a tin of sugar and a shrug that said, "We save who we can." They ate stale bread and told stories not as entertainment but as mapping. Who might help, who owed goat to who, what stores were left in the wagoner's shed at the South Fork. Cole, who had spent a life thinking of himself as alone, watched women trading favors like currency and realized the richness of a network he had never counted on. The patrols followed them in patterns. The cavalry stampeded through the valley in fits of righteous certainty, convinced they would unearth fugitives by brute force. What they did not count on was the economy of care, Aiyana's knowledge, Maria's larder, the secret signals of a woman's dress flapped just so across a fence post. Each step they took made a new compact. Cole earned respect without trying. Aiyana watched him learn humility and skill. His hands that learned to tie knots differently were the hands that would not seize her as property, but would hold her steady in a fight. Unlikely alliances are made of both necessity and moral recalibration. Their alliance was both. They found a place to breathe in a small settlement on the river's bend, where the town's storefronts leaned together like neighbors in conversation. The place had been a forgotten way station, a trading post that could not quite decide whether it belonged to a map or to the weather. The people who lived there were not heroes. They were bakers and laundresses, and women who kept journals of births and bad winters. For Aiyana, it was a quiet that invited action rather than despair. She set up a small healing table in the back of an old stable, a sign painted by Maria in letters that were not loud. Aiyana's remedies, for fever, for grief. There was work to be done. Children with croup came in with mothers who smelled faintly of sage and whiskey. Men with fevers came in smelling worse. Fathers whose hands were raw from wintering stock asked for poultices with the shame of men who had been taught pain is vanity. Aiyana found herself moving through the room with a practiced choreography, her presence a steady metronome for small bodies beating unevenly. The simple act of treating another's fever was enough to remind her that she had currency that men in coats could not smear away. Knowledge, usefulness, the quiet power of being the one people turned to when flint and faith were not enough. Cole took to sweeping the stable. It was a humble job, and he did it with a dignity he had not known his life would demand. The work kept his hands busy and his guilt unspent. It made him useful without making him necessary in the way he had once thought necessary. He fetched water, listened to the women's gossip as if he'd been taught a new language, and in return Auntie Ruth, keeper of keys and secrets, left him an extra biscuit now and then. The two of them settled into a rhythm that was not romance so much as the stitching of lives. In those small days, Aiyana began to imagine a future more detailed than grief's soft blur. She kept a ledger, small, coded, of herbs sold and remedies traded. She bartered with flour and blankets, and slowly, the floorboard beneath her bed held a little more silver. Her hands, mended by dealing with other people's aches, had a steadier certainty. She taught Cole to hold a mortar without the restlessness of a man who expected violence to resettle his nerves into neatness. She introduced him to the idea of tying off a wound with willow bark after a particularly long night. He watched her work with the same reverence a child had, and when she corrected his technique, she did so with the casual authority of someone who knew the anatomy of survival. She had her misgivings. She remembered her husband and the boy like pieces of a map with the center gone. The ache sometimes arrived without warning, and she would be at a supply table stirring a cure when the rest of the world sucked the air from her lungs. Healing others did not mean she was mended, but it changed what grief could do. Instead of being a defining axis that bent her life into submission, it became a power that gave her clarity. There were things to fix that did not involve the lieutenant's badge, and there were people who needed her. That clarity birthed plans that had teeth. The town's women, quietly led by Maria, Ruth, and a few others, were not inclined to simply let Finch and his cavalry redraw rights on a whim. They had been bruised by men's wars before. They had lost children and husbands and small businesses the way the river took stones. They were ready for a different sort of fight, one that started with paper and voice instead of gunpowder. Aiyana found herself at the center of this slow revolution, not because she wanted influence, but because influence was what you built when you had a place where people could come and be made whole. Her leadership was not theatrical. She organized trades, negotiated with a rancher for grain in exchange for mending his feverish wife, and coached a group of younger women on what to do when soldiers came to the town to count heads. She taught them how to write a letter, simple, precise, that could be delivered to a sympathetic judge in the capital. She trained them in the diplomacy that comes from being underestimated, the ability to slip a convincing refusal in a pocket of agreement. These were small acts, but each one tucked a coin into the chest of their power. The quietest part of her transformation was how she let herself imagine safety. She had been raised to make do with the frayed edges of possibility. Now she contemplated a future with a roof that did not echo with the memory of boots and a ledger, where her name meant something more than survivor. She began to set aside money, seed to seed, until the floorboard became less an emergency fund and more an inheritance she intended to leave to others. Cole watched that change without attempting to steer it. He learned from the women, particularly Maria, how to speak with less swagger and more sense. The more he listened, the more he realized his prior life had been built on moments of violence passed off as necessity. He had been taught to measure a man's worth by how he could reduce another to ground. and in the slow mechanic of the stable, he planted new measures. How one holds another's hand when they are sick, how one keeps a weary body fed. His own redemption was not dramatic. It was slow and honest. He started wanting to be worthy of the trust Aiyana had placed in him, and that desire shaped him into a man who could stand beside her instead of in front. In the evenings, they sat by the stable hearth. They did not talk much about the past. When they did, it was with the simple currency of fact and little of the dramatic flourish the town's men liked in stories. They planned land that could be bought, a registry to protect those who had been displaced, testimony collected against men who thought their badges made them law. She would be the voice. He would be the ears and hands. The partnership was practical, fair, and growing. Her wounds were not invisible. They simply moved into a place where they informed strategy rather than immobilized it. She was finally at the place where grief and talent made her dangerous in the best sense. She knew how to heal, and she knew how to hurt when it suited justice. She had not healed completely. She never would, but she was learning how to live, to work, to plan, to rely on others without letting go of herself. Cole had his own quiet grief tucked in the way he rubbed his shoulder when he thought no one noticed. Nights sometimes carried whispers of a past life, a courthouse brawl that left a man dead, a judge's red seal, and a ride that turned into an escape. He had not been innocent of violence, nor did he pretend otherwise. His life had been a ledger balanced by quick hands and quicker decisions, yet the ledger had a crack. Something he had done, or refused to do, had put Finch on his scent. Whether Finch saw justice in the blade of his boot, or whether he saw only a shape to be punished, Cole could not tell. What he offered Aiyana was what he had learned to do: survive the unavoidable, and later, to put that survival toward a different sort of good. He told her his story slowly, as if he were a seamster reluctant to fray delicate edges. He had been a gunslinger of some renown, a man who lived by aim and speed, until a night when orders and conscience collided. He had taken a stand for a woman the law would have otherwise hidden under ledger entries. That stand had come at a cost. A man with influence died, and Finch had decided an example had to be made. Before long, bounty posters learned his face, and cavalry found excuses to ride where they pleased. Some men believed in men like Cole because they were simple answers. Other men saw them as an encapsulation of the frontier's messier truth. Aiyana listened without blinking. There was an economy of secrets between them. How she had been there in spirit the night he made a choice. How he had been at a distance the day her cabin burned. His former life was not a glamorous redemption arc, but a necessary part of their strategy. Cole's experience had given him the tools Finch didn't understand. How to move quietly, how to make a caravan a cloak, how to make a former enemy see a different light before pulling a trigger. These were the skills Aiyana needed if she intended to bring Finch into the light of consequence, rather than let his crimes travel in the dark. She began to use his past like a planner uses a map that once burned, as data. Where Finch had struck, where his men raised a dust that smelled like law and blame, Cole could point to patterns most would miss. He remembered supply routes, a stable where cavalry liked to stop for brandy, a lieutenant's habit of writing letters that began with, "For the good of our men." He had died a terrible number of times inside his head, and each time woken as a man a little different. He could be her partner in the sense that he would supply the muscle and the knowledge to match her moral compass. This did not mean he was a subordinate. Aiyana held the decisions. If Cole's knowledge was a tool, she was the one who determined its aim. When he suggested a diversion meant to lure Finch to a place where witnesses would be present, she vetoed it for fear of innocent lives. When she insisted on turning a man's arrogance into a mistake, he listened. Their dynamic grew into something whose center was not one person. He would never be the man who took the pen from her hand and wrote their story in ink he favored. He respected that. He admired her moral threading more than his own reckoning, and it humbled him. Finch's past, once exposed, was a mirror. Cole had watched how the lieutenant's cruelty had been lauded in dispatches. The lieutenant believed carving the world with a boot was a kind of management. Where Finch thought cruelty was necessary for order, Aiyana believed order required compassion. They were opposite poles who shared one relentless energy, a belief in consequence. They took advice from one another. Cole taught Aiyana how to read a patrol's cadence, how a drill left a tell in the way a man held his horse, the time between trumpet and call. Aiyana taught him how to calm a fever with Willow's bark, and how to use the softer art of listening to get a man to give himself up. She taught him to interrogate without cruelty, to see that sometimes a man's confession was worth more than his silence if you wished to change a town's memory. Behind these lessons, a quiet attraction built, like sap in a tree, slow, necessary, and not wholly romanticized. She watched him grow less theatrical, more exact. He watched her grow less defensive, more willing to imagine agency as a future rather than a salvage operation. Their devotion was not to rescue, but to reciprocity. He He would offer protection when it was needed. She would make decisions he would follow because the choice fit moral calculus rather than power dynamics. His outlaw skills, his knowledge of maps and patience under pressure became extensions of her plans. He would shadow a supply wagon and lift a ledger authorizing one of Finch's detachments to move to a different village. She would use that ledger as a lever to expose the lieutenant's chain of command. Cole's past was not ancillary. It became a resource that served her purpose. It gave her the means to fight back in a way a woman alone could rarely muster in the shadow of brass. Yet the deeper lesson ran both ways. Cole found in Aiyana's moral clarity a cause that let him redirect his own rage toward something constructive. He learned that courage was not merely the barrel of a gun, but also the willingness to stand in a room and say the truth. He learned humility from midwives and mercy from widows. Finch's threat was real, but the work they did beside each other softened the edges of what vengeance could become: law. Her choices defined what justice should look like, and his skills helped make it possible. Aiyana's truth was a ledger of losses that resisted easy apology. She could list the names, the dates, the fields where the fires had been set with the neat cruelty of men who thought property settled everything. The soldiers came with proclamations and maps that had the audacity to call itself progress. Men like Finch were the shorthand for a system that flattened existence into decimal points: land, livestock, ledgers, and the occasional acceptable casualty. She knew the phrase, "for the peace of the territory," intimately. It had been written once where her husband would not be buried. To say she wanted justice was to understate a narrower, more specific hunger. She wanted Finch to be recognized not because a ledger demanded it, but because the ledger had been wrong. She wanted testimony to stand where night raids had stood for years. It was not vengeance for its own sake. It was a reclamation of narrative. Men like Finch wrote the script for where the bodies would be buried. She wanted him to write a different ending, to sign an admission so clean that it would undo in the public record the erasure he'd practiced. Justice, for her, meant the chance for other women to live without waking to the sound of men's boots. The town's women, midwives, shopkeepers, widows, felt the same pinch of wrongness. They had been humiliated by orders and threatened with reprisal. For some of them, the question was practical. How do we keep our children fed when men of the law take cattle for a requisition? For Aiyana, the question also had a spiritual weight. How to speak when the official story was not truth? She could have packed her locket and left. Joined another migration meant for women who left the past behind and were content to call themselves survivors. Instead, she wrote letters. She went to the market and traded for paper. She interviewed witnesses, farmers who had seen the cavalry's route, a widow whose husband had been taken and never returned, a courier who'd seen the lieutenant sign off on extrajudicial orders. For each statement taken, Aiyana recorded the teller's manner, the smell of the place where they had spoken, the exact words they used. She built a dossier, small as a heart and sharp as a blade. Cole's role, crucial and earthbound, was to fetch corroboration from places soldiers liked to forget, stables and outposts where men loosened their tongues after a bottle. He came back with scraps of paper and a ledger that didn't lie, shipments labeled for requisition that were nowhere near an army's needs, receipts for goods moved without record of ownership. It was evidence of a particular greed, men who used law to steal and to render people silent. She was angry. Anger, for someone like Aiyana, was not theatrical. It was a tool she balanced with the same care she used when pouring hot tea into brittle cups. She could have let the anger make her cruel. Instead, she made it exact. She wrote to a judge in the nearest town with a practical tone that would sting a lawyer's sense with its clarity. She bundled testimonies, wrapped them in a narrative that could not be easily dismissed. She went to a courthouse and watched how men looked at her with a curiosity at once condescending and faintly alarmed. A native woman speaking with the ease of someone who had learned the language of paperwork. Her voice, when she spoke in that courtroom, had the force of facts. Finch responded the way men do who think their power is absolute. He increased patrols. He sent men to scare witnesses into silence. He made sure that any story that threatened to gather momentum was either discredited or suppressed. There were nights she couldn't sleep because the cavalry's hooves sounded too close, because she was not sure whether a witness's fear would hold when threatened by Finch's lieutenant. That fear, always prescient, made her take harder choices. Conceal a ledger, move a witness to Maria's larder, bribe a courier. She balanced risk with arithmetic. She did not gamble recklessly. But when it was clear Finch intended to crush this small uprising by force, when he sent an emissary with a promise of protection that smelled like an ultimatum, Aiyana realized that a more visible blow was necessary. She would not create violence for its own sake. She would, however, make sure that when violence occurred, it fell on the man who had used it first. If Finch wanted a fight so he could look like a just man, she would give him a fight that would strip the gloss from his uniform and show the townspeople what lay beneath it. She called a meeting in Ruth's parlor. The room smelled of tea and mended curtains. Women came in boots and skirts patched with practicality, eyes wary but steady. They were not warriors training for the raid. They were sisters who had learned how to shepherd lives through chaos. Their plan was not a battle plan in the soldierly sense. It was a strategy of exposure. They would gather evidence, they would broadcast it, so far as possible in a place where news traveled by word and by hand. They would make sure the larger populace could not claim ignorance. Cole would be the one who took a risk and diverted a patrol away from a witness. He would not be asked to kill. Aiyana would expose Finch, not in the heat of a skirmish, but in the cool light of a courthouse where documents mattered. Her fight was legal and moral as much as it was physical. She had lived long enough to know the beauty of law could be weaponized. She intended to use it as shield rather than as a weapon to bludgeon. When she told Cole the plan, he looked at her as if she had handed him a new kind of rifle, familiar in shape and deadly in its intention. He would ride under the guise of being a highwayman, something the town's men could understand, and he would steal what he had to steal to prove Finch's corruption. She would publish affidavits. The gamble was calibrated, rumor and paperwork, witness and witness. It required courage, and above all, a woman's patience. Aiyana's truth had teeth now. It would not be enough to shout at a lieutenant. It would require patience, cunning, and an unrelenting application of the small grace she'd honed, the ability to be a healer and a strategist at once. She had learned to hold two contradictory things in her head, the tender art of saving a life and the hard arithmetic of arranging men like Finch into places where they couldn't hide. That duality made her dangerous in the best sense. She would not be consumed by grief. She would live by it, and through it, make a very particular kind of justice. The map they drew together looked cruder than it was. Cole would ride at dawn when the patrols changed horses. Aiyana would be in the courthouse with affidavits to be notarized. Maria smuggled in a clerk who owed her a favor. Ruth polished the lamp at the back of the room so witnesses' faces would be clear. The plan relied on ordinary people doing extraordinary things, women who could wield a letter as deftly as a knife. They trained until training felt less like rehearsal and more like muscle memory. Cole taught a small group, mostly men who were tired of being his former enemies, how to create a diversion without killing. He taught them to set fires in the brush that would steer a patrol's attention to the west, to tie lanterns and leave enough evidence to look convincing but not destroy property. He walked with his hands on his hips like someone who had never learned to be gentle and was trying on gentleness for the first time. Aiyana trained the women of the town in the other skills: how to take a depositions without leading the witness, how to hide a ledger where a mounted patrol would not look, how to recognize when a man's apology was simply smoke. She taught Cole to speak with a judge. His muzzle of a mouth learned to form sentences that were not threats. He learned to present evidence as if it was an offering rather than a demand. She watched him sitting in the courthouse during a recess, hands folded, learning to care about the shape of a testimony. It was an erotic revolution, two people remaking themselves around a shared purpose. There was tenderness in their equality. Neither of them performed disproportionate dominion. When Cole fretted over the ethics of diversionary tactics, Aiyana listened and then redirected him gently. When she considered an approach that risked the town, Cole stepped forward, not as the man offering martial salvation, but as the partner reminding her of consequences. Their arguments were practical and fast. They ended in consensus because both understood the cost of being wrong. The partnership deepened as their wounds were exposed and tended. Cole admitted that he had been a man who ran when things got messy because running was safer than consequence. Aiyana admitted that justice sometimes tasted like suffering if you let it. They traded stories like men trade bullets, careful, with an awareness that every shot spent changed the world. He began to trust her strategy. She began to trust his instincts on danger. That trust manifested in small moments. Him listening to her when she planned a raid disguised as a caravan, not interrupting but offering a tweak that would save a life. Her holding him after nightmares in which he relived the man whose death set Finch on his trail. They taught each other. Aiyana showed him the names of plants that made inflammation recede. He taught her the pattern of a cavalry patrol through the valley based on the angle of the sun when they moved. She discovered with a private pleasure that his big hands were deft at tying a ligature, and that his voice could be gentle when he read aloud the affidavits they would use. The town's women admired the way Cole learned. He did not want to be the hero who rescued their leader. He wanted to be quiet and useful. He welcomed correction and found it dignifying. In a place where men had typically insisted on certain roles, his humility was almost scandalous. It made him more attractive than any swaggering display. For Aiyana, attraction had always been complicated. It required a man who could respect the cost of what she carried, and who would not try to trade her sorrow for the illusion of salvation. Cole fit that fragile profile. Underneath all of it, they found a rhythm of safety and desire that neither had expected. They had disagreements over who should ride the diversion, over whether to risk a child's witness, but they always returned to the same bedrock. They made decisions together. She signed off on tactical things, and he delivered. She steered the moral compass. He nudged toward practicality. They completed each other like two halves of a plan. In one electric afternoon, when the wind came off the plain and the valley smelled of distant rain, Cole surprised Aiyana by showing up at the stable with a packet he had taken from a lieutenant's trunk during a diversion. Inside were orders, small, banal, and incriminating. Lists of requisitioned supplies redirected to the lieutenant's private ledger, a map of which farms were to be swept of supplies. He looked up at her, eyes bright with something like a child's triumph. "You said you needed paper," he said, voice low. She laughed then, a sound that rolled out like loosening rope. It was not a laugh of relief so much as joy, an odd mounting glee that the world's truth suddenly had edges she could cut with. She kissed him softly, the movement more of gratitude than possession. It was a moment of choice. She could let it become something slippery and dangerous, or it could remain what it was, an acknowledgement of shared victory. They chose partnership. In doing so, they made their romance a tool for the larger work rather than its conclusion. Each step they took together was measured with a mutual respect that made others in the town want to trust them. Their bond was a quiet, formidable thing. Two people who had learned to fight and to heal and were finally using both skills to reshape the place that had nearly undone them. The plan held for 3 weeks like a poised breath. The documents Cole had salvaged told a story of a lieutenant who treated the law as though it were a ledger to be plundered. Aiyana felt a new clarity with that dossier, like a woman who discovers that the map of her country had a hidden border she could claim. They had circulated manifestos, gathered depositions, and slowly shaped a case that would be hard to dismiss in a court of law. The town had rallied. Men and women who had previously thought economy meant submission now whispered the names of the accused with a new boldness. But the world is not kind to those who choose truth in a valley under a show of force. Finch's response was to consolidate. He began to move faster, tighter, as if compressing the air until the necks of townspeople would snap. He sent men to the river to intimidate the trader, to the stable to test the horses, to the schoolhouse to check attendance. It was a small war of attrition. She could have cowered. She could have bought a wagon and fled with her locket and the ledger and a plan to start over. The choice was painfully simple and devastating in equal measure. Safety, for herself and the quiet few who already trusted her, or justice, which might cost everything. That was the moment when the idea of future shifted from a possibility to a demand. If she chose safety, Finch would keep his pattern. If she chose to fight, she would need to put herself at personal risk and accept whatever that risk would take. Her mind anchored on something older than desire for punishment. She thought of the widows who'd come to her for poultices and had later been coaxed into silence by the lieutenant's men. She thought of the children who would inherit a region where men like Finch wrote rules with their boots. She thought of the way a woman's life could be dismantled with a ledger and a signature. The fight was not just for her, it was for their possibility. Cole offered an escape route. He had friends in the South who would take them across a line into a place where no ledger would reach them. He said it quietly, as though proposing a last kindness. She loved him for the softness of the offer. She refused him for the integrity of the cause. When she declined, the look he gave her was not defeat. It was confirmation, a reason that somewhat aligned with his own newfound conscience. "We leave together or we don't," she said, simple as a ledger entry. He nodded. They had reached an inflection point where neither wanted to live by a compromise of escape. That night they sat together, planning what their life might look like if Finch were out of the picture. A small house with a garden the women of the town helped build, a registry for women's property rights, a clinic that took in Apache and settler alike. They imagined a place where the future was a garden and not a ledger of loss. The quietness before the storm had a sweetness. They walked to the river and sat on the bank, their shoulders brushing. The world was a wide, indifferent thing. But in those moments, dreams were allowed to be tender and specific. Aiyana thought of the healing lodge she wanted to build, one not defined by fear, but crafted by the gentle insistence of care. She imagined shelves of jars labeled by what they did, rather than by who might profit. She imagined a bench under a tree where older women would teach girls how to read the land. "It's not about you and me," she said. "It's about making sure the next woman doesn't have to decide the way we had to decide." Cole squeezed her hand. He had never been asked to hold a future with another person before. He wished to be worthy of the trust. The hush between them was not emptiness, but a pact. He would fight at her side because he believed in the thing she wanted to build, not because he wanted to be the hero of it. The day before they would present the compiled evidence to the magistrate, Finch's cavalry rode closer to the town than they had in months. The beat of the hooves sounded like a countdown, and Aiyana felt the incline of the world change. The choice had been made. Now came the consequences. They had a plan. It was precise, lawful, and risky. She had measured every step against the lives of others and concluded it was the right way forward. There was a last temptation. A man in brass, someone with a badge and a smile, offered her a place on a caravan bound for the east, a chance to vanish with a kindness that smelled suspiciously like abandonment. She thought of the ledger, of the widows, of the child she'd lost. There was no chance she would leave. She had chosen the hard thing, and felt in that terrible clarity that the choice was right. On the night before the hearing, under a thin moon, Aiyana looked at Cole and spoke a vow that was not a plea nor a wish, but a plan. Whatever happens in that courtroom, we will stand together. We will do it as equals. He answered not with words but with his presence, steady, unassuming. They had the future in their hands, and it felt, at once, terrifying and unbearably right. Word has a way of becoming threat when it reaches the wrong ears. The dossier Aiyana had sent to the magistrate had been compelling, wrapped in witness statements and the kind of evidence that, in a just world, would have unseated a lieutenant. Instead, it arrived in a place where men with badges could still pretend to be both judge and jury. Finch reacted the way predators do when their favorite place is in danger of being illuminated. He doubled down. That morning, the lieutenant led a patrol into the town with the swagger of a man who expects obedience. He did not yet arrest Aiyana. He wanted the optics. He wanted the townspeople to see a woman pressured into silence while he took his righteous inventory in public. His men rifled through stalls and storehouses, loudly searching for contraband that belonged to no one. They threatened a witness named Eli, who ran a ferry across the river. When the women of the town protested, a small but vociferous group of widows and mothers, Finch smirked like a man who expected theater. Aiyana's heart tightened. She had expected pressure, but now the stakes were wildly public. A man might be crushed by the weight of a single brass boot on his throat, and the town might be made to feel the cost of noticing. Finch seemed to be trying to reset the world. If people were afraid, they would go back to a state of obedience. He wanted silence. It was then that Cole's past made itself known in an unwelcome way. An old enemy, someone Cole had wronged in the days when his life had been a ledger of fewer consequences, saw an opportunity. He sent a note to Finch hinting that Cole's presence in the town meant trouble. Perhaps he thought Finch would use the accusation for his own vengeance, or perhaps he wanted Cole broken for personal gain. Either way, the lieutenant's men converged with renewed cruelty. The conspiracies folded into each other, personal vendettas braiding with institutional power. Aiyana refused to be cowed. She called the women in again, and together they set a plan into motion. The strategy had multiple strands: public affidavits in the magistrate's hands, diversions to keep men from trespassing where witnesses hid, and a signal system among the women for when things grew hot. Maria had already moved Eli and his family across the river. Ruth had closed the shop. They began to look less like victims and more like a community that could not easily be bullied. The cavalry's return, however, was larger and sharper. On the eve before the hearing, men in brass lit torches and gathered at the edge of town. Their leader, Finch, called for order in the voice of a man who commands a field to be mown. They went house to house. The town's fury did not erupt into violence. It was colder, more dangerous. Finch used intimidation like a broom, sweeping the town's soup into a drain. A betrayal struck from inside. The trader who had once sold supplies to Aiyana's healing lodge, out of fear and loaned greed, sold the names of witnesses to a lieutenant's man. Aiyana felt that betrayal like a physical blow. The knowledge that not every person who had once been her neighbor was loyal enough to risk their freedom for the truth. The trader claimed debts, and men with debts often forget the cost of being on the right side of history. They were trapped in a town that now looked smaller by the hour. The magistrate sent word he would hear the case the following morning, but Finch's presence complicated custody of witnesses. He could at any time arrest someone on a pretext. He could, in the worst case, escalate violence and make the courtroom moot. The threat piled up. It was a storm on the horizon. In response, Aiyana did the hard, quiet thing she had always done. She started to prepare others for action. Women who had been protectors for generations, like Nanatashi, an elder Apache woman who had once tended to the very same valley, stood with her in the night. Nanatashi brought younger women to train in concealment and retrieval. They practiced spirit songs that could be used as warnings. They chiseled a code into the underside of a bench where they kept their accounts. The women reached out across cultural lines. Native neighbors, remembering older protections, gave them techniques for moving in the brush without leaving a trace. They were rebuilding the map of safety with hands that had once painted it. Cole tried to contain his own past mistakes from erupting into catastrophe. He set small traps near likely patrol routes, slicked branches and false tracks that would mislead a cavalryman accustomed to the obvious. He worked the night and came back bruised. But the diversions worked in small ways, enough to keep the greatest of Finch's men from finding the most important witnesses. Each wedge bought them a little more time, which for a legal strategy can be like buying a new road. The conspiracies thickened. Finch, for all his bravado, was not infinite in power. He had enemies who were waiting for him to make one misstep. Aiyana's dossier and the women's quiet resolve were a mirror they could not break. Yet the pressure was real. They were staring down a lieutenant who believed himself untouchable, and a town where betrayals had deeper roots than they wanted to see. By nightfall, the town felt thinner. People who had been on the sidelines slid into places where they had to choose sides. It was a dangerous thing to make a town choose, but the alternative was ruin. Aiyana felt the pull of history hard as gravity. In the pressure, she made decisions like a surgeon, pragmatic, necessary, sometimes unkind. The women around her breathed together and took their places. When the sun rose the following morning, Aiyana walked to the courthouse with affidavits in her pocket and a resolve that was not for the faint-hearted. Finch watched, his jaw moving like a man who felt entitled to the shape of the world. He did not know that the woman with a medicine bag and a ledger was the only thing he had not counted. He did not know that, in the night, other women had learned how to tie a message to a rock and float it down a river, or how to set a lantern in a window to signal readiness. He had not calculated for solidarity, because men like him rarely did. They were ready to fight in a way that mattered. The hearing began with the courthouse packed and tension so thick, the walls seemed to hold their breath. Aiyana presented her dossier with the same steady hand she used for poultices. Witnesses gave statements, some shaking, others with the quiet certainty of people who know truth. The magistrate, a man of ink-stained hands, listened, while Finch paced like a wolf near the edge of a pen. For a few hours, it seemed as if law and evidence might do what they were designed to do. But the world is not always ruled by documents. Finch had his own arsenal, friends with ledgered ambitions and men willing to push the limit of law into lawlessness. While the magistrate considered motions, a mounted patrol emerged in the square, shouting about a rebellion. It was a deliberate move, chaos intended to distract. A younger, impressionable soldier burst into the courtroom and accused a witness, Eli, of theft. The accusation was flimsy, and yet a clerk found a reason to remove Eli from the room, required assistance, and a promise of safety. The clerk's promise was a thin thing, and men like Finch used those thin things as weapons. Then betrayal struck from within the town's fragile coalition. The traitor, the man who had accepted bribes to sell ledger names, finally acted on his self-interest. He had allies in higher places who feared exposure. He revealed to Finch a hidden list of witnesses who had been promised anonymity. Finch moved. In the span of an hour, rifles thundered outside. Guards were called to restore order. The lure worked. When individuals were singled out, terror made them small. Eli was taken, and with him went a sense of the fight's invulnerability. The worst came swift and precise. Cole, who had volunteered to lead a diversion to keep Finch's men away from the magistrate long enough for subpoenas to be served, was betrayed by a man he had once trusted. This man, a former companion in nights that had become Cassius's shameful currency, had sold Cole out to Finch for a promised pardon. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. It was personal and catalytic all at once. Finch's men seized Cole in the market, pinned him against a wagon with a sniper's aim. The town held its breath as the lieutenant grinned like a man watching an execution of theory. Aiyana felt the world tilt. Cole, who had become her partner and the man who had stilled the brittle parts of her life, was dragged away under a humiliating insult. Finch declared him guilty in the square, read out a charge that had been cooked free of evidence, and offered his public favor to those who would endorse the verdict. The townsfolk, terrified of what the lieutenant might do if they did not comply, yielded. Men who had been leaning close to the women's cause shrank back into the warm, predictable fold of obsequiousness. She moved through the crush of people like a thing with a precise aim. Anger was a heat that burned out of function unless it was trained. Aiyana had trained it into a kind of instrument. She tried to speak, to demand a proper hearing for Cole, but Finch used the law as a curtain and a cudgel. He ordered Cole held, and with the town still under the impression that law was in his pocket, he planned an example. Aiyana's hand went to the little silver locket under her shirt. The cold metal steadied her. She felt the weight of what she'd promised to fight for, not just for herself, but for the community that had rallied. She also felt the sting of failure. Part of her wondered if she had been naive to believe paperwork mattered more than bullets. The ledger had been persuasive. No ledger had warmed the cold hunger in men who thought themselves above consequence. Her darkest hour arrived like a man with a torch and a deliberate intention to see everything burn. The townspeople she'd counted on, traders and ranchers, closed their doors. Maria and Ruth had done what they could, hid witnesses, smuggled children, and worked like a thinned net to catch anything that flew. But when Finch took one of the central figures, Cole. Her plan that had been carefully assembled and balanced on alliances looked fragile. It felt like a house built of urgent hope that could not sustain the weight of men in brass. Aiyana did not break. She felt the old pattern, the one that had always led a woman back to trade and tactic, take over. She called for Ruth and Maria. She asked for Nanatashi and the younger women. There was no time for despair. The work required a recalibration. She rescinded a course and spun another. There were nights when she would imagine herself simply leaving, carrying her locket and her little ledger and vanishing beyond the hills. But she could not abandon Cole or the 20 small lives that had been hidden in Eli's larder. Instead, she steeled herself. She took the evidence and compressed it into a single urgent gift. A letter addressed to the colonel who oversaw Finch's company, hand-delivered with witnesses and proof. It was an audacious move and likely to be labeled a desperate one. But desperate is sometimes the form justice takes when the system is rotten. She also whispered plans in the ears of women who had been trained to be midwives and now were trained to be guardians of testimony. They lit lanterns in a pattern barely visible to enemies but clear to friends. They would not be silent. They might lose, and they might not get what they wanted, but they would exhaust every possibility first. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation or the prisoner dragged in chains. It was that the betrayal made the world smaller, a reduced map where safety was a rumor. Aiyana felt how close she was to losing the last thin thing that had kept her from despair. A man who had chosen, against his best instincts, to stand with her. Now he was in enemy hands, and the town watched as though this were a play they had been given seats to, rather than a life they were living. The town's silence felt like the weight of a blanket pressed over a face. In that shrouded place, Aiyana found a different kind of clarity. She realized that strategy must always be backed by courage, that courage must be undergirded by the willingness to break rules when rules are being used as weapons. She would not let Finch's tyranny dictate the terms of their life. If the world was going to be remade, she would be among those who made it. If the darkness was deep, then the climb out of it required tools forged by necessity. Aiyana gathered them, her dossier, a chorus of witnesses and women who had nothing left to lose. She had often healed with hands that could be gentle and exact. Now she would treat a wound of a different nature. She assembled an operation that looked in outline like a practical plan. Get Cole free, expose Finch, and secure testimony so that the lieutenant's influence would not be a weapon against witnesses. First, she led a rescue. It was not a romantic raid led by men with swagger, but a precise movement of minds and small muscles. Nanatashi taught the group how to move silently across the riverbed at low water. Ruth coordinated the diversion with lanterns mounted in certain windows to confuse the patrols. Maria supplied a wagon that looked like it carried flour but was rigged with false bottoms to carry their tools. Younger women who had learned how to hide in plain sight, laundresses, grocers, school teachers, were crucial. They could move in a town without suspicion. They were the perfect camouflage. Aiyana herself took the lead in the breach. She walked up to the guardhouse with a basket of herbs, women's work, harmless in appearance, and requested an audience with the lieutenant. Finch laughed when he saw her, expecting the usual capitulation. Then she did the thing he had not predicted. She began to speak in the voice that had led women to the courthouse in the first place. She spoke a witness's testimony aloud, in detail, naming dates and men. She told him calmly, without hysteria, of shipments redirected and orders misused. As Finch's face hardened, the crowd began to listen. She had turned what had been treated as gossip into public claim. The diversion worked because Finch's men, accustomed to underestimating women, were caught off balance by the precision of the accusations and the presence of a larger, angry populace. While his attention was jarred and the magistrate was distracted by an echo of scandal, the women executed the secondary plan. The guardhouse's back gate was left unlocked by a young washerwoman who had once courted the guard and now remembered his favorite brand of soap. Small human favors, purely social, became instruments. Cole slipped from chains because men did not expect women to be courageous, but when they did, their courage could be a kind of sleight of hand. Cole's escape, when it came, was not cinematic. It was a mix of handshakes, soft whispered instructions, and rope under a wagon. He emerged smaller than expected, hauling himself through a gap like a man reborn and ashamed of the triumph he'd achieved through cunning rather than force. Aiyana did not run to him. She watched, because she had learned that sometimes love is measured by how someone waits to see their partner return intact. When he stood before her, bruised and exhausted, she took his face in her hands, not to fix him, but to mark his presence as an equal. "You were reckless," she told him. "And you were brave," he said. They did not fall into the cliché of lovers saved. They had saved and been saved in equal measure. That balance mattered. The rescue was the beginning, not the end. After Cole was free, Aiyana revealed her final move, a public confrontation designed not just to get revenge, but to create a record. She arranged for witnesses to be present and for the magistrate's clerk, who had been grudgingly sympathetic, to present evidence. They had secured depositions that implicated Finch's chain of command. The women together walked into the square and began to speak, one by one, their tales forming a chorus of the same truth. They testified to seizures of property, to men frightened into silence, to orders that were never lawful but had the force of a gun. Finch tried to silence them with the swagger of authority. He ordered men forward. The crowd watched, a sea of faces leaning towards something like hope. Then something unexpected happened. Soldiers from another detachment, who had been already skeptical of Finch's small empire, arrived. They had received Aiyana's hand-delivered letter the night before, evidence and witness lists, and had come to observe. Their presence balanced the scales. Men who fashioned themselves above reproach crumble when confronted by their peers. Finch was arrested in the square. It was not a dramatic duel, but a bureaucratic legal undoing. An inspector read the orders that freed up men and declared Finch under suspicion for malfeasance. He was handcuffed with the same casual precision he had once used to detain others. The humiliating part for Finch was less the shackles than the public scrutiny. Men in brass did not appreciate being made an exhibit. His fury was the kind of small, contained storm that had nowhere to go. The victory did not look like a parade. It was a long procession of paperwork and testimony that required patience. It took days to process, and for a time the town remained on edge. But it mattered that the lieutenant's reputation was punctured in public. People began to speak openly. Witnesses who had been muzzled found courage. A jury convened. The law, when forced to face evidence, does something awkward. It tries to be fair. Throughout the triumph, the women did what women always do. They organized care. The injured were tended, children were given soups, and life resumed with a new, precarious normal. But the change was tangible. A deputy declared a temporary protection for the women's witnesses. Landowners who had feared Finch's reprisals now found themselves accountable to legal processes. It was not a utopia, it was a restructuring. On the last night of the trial, after the magistrate's eyes had grown tired and the town had breathed a cautious breath of relief, Cole and Aiyana walked to the river again. The place smelled of wet earth and something like a beginning. They did not promise each other tidy things. Instead, they spoke practical futures. A clinic with an official sign, land with papers in her name, a registry to protect women's property. They knew love had to be built around respect, not convenience. When they kissed, it was a pledge between equals, to be partners in work and life, not saviors. She had risen through fury and patience, through the steady accretion of small acts that combined became an unignorable force. They had won not because bullets had spoken loudest, but because truth had been laboriously, stubbornly set down on paper and supported by a town that had learned how crucial a woman's voice could be. The trial that followed was not a single thunderclap, but a slow unraveling of Finch's authority, evidence piled with the inexorable logic of fact. Witnesses recounted names and times and places, and the magistrate could not, in conscience and law, ignore a pattern that suggested systemic theft and abuse. It was the women's testimony, each voice steady as an old oak, that finally made the difference. They did not dramatize. They recited details with the clinical calm of midwives and ledger keepers. The jury, a mix of men who had never had to listen and men who finally learned the value of being silent and attentive, had little choice. Finch's defense was predictable. He blamed subordinate men, he invoked order, he painted his actions as necessary for frontier safety, but the ledger fought him. Cole's stolen documents, once authenticated, showed a chain of orders that bore his signature or his seal. The traitor's earlier confession, now publicly retracted and weighed with the moral shame of his own consequences, was a turning point. He admitted his part in the middle of the session, the shame folding his shoulders like an old coat. For those who watched, confession looked human and, in a way, instructive. A man could be convulsed by his own smallness and choose to be larger. Aiyana spoke last. She rose and walked to the stand with the surety of a woman who had made herself a house out of truth. She did not speak superlatives. She recited what she had seen, told the court about misplaced shipments, about soldiers who had been encouraged to arrest men without cause because it made the ledger look tidy. She told them about a man who had lost a son to a raid, and about how the lieutenant had stood over the graves and called his action a duty. She did not ask for blood, she asked for accountability. When she finished, a silence descended in the court, like snowfall. The verdict was not immediate, and the delay was kind of hanging agony for everyone who had spent months in fear. When the jury came back, Finch was found guilty on several counts: misuse of authority, embezzlement of supplies, and ordering unlawful seizures. He was sentenced to confinement and to make restitution where possible. It was not perfect justice. Courts rarely serve catharsis, but it was an outcome that prevented men like Finch from continuing to cast the law as a personal whip. The triumph rippled. The settlement's women now had a legal precedent. The magistrate, chastened by the process, set up a small register to protect women's claims to property. An imperfect instrument, but one that recognized the reality Aiyana had fought for. That property rights and legal recognition mattered when men with belts and badges decided to use authority as theft. The town's traders recalibrated their relationship with the cavalry. They began to require receipts and public witnesses.
The ripple became a current. Cole's redemption was quieter but no less real. He had provided documents and risked his liberty. He had not been the hero of the gunfight. He had been the man who chose to change. The town accepted him as a man who had sinned and then worked to atone. For him, the key was acceptance, not as a pass to collect redemption like a coin, but as an invitation to be part of a community that now counted him as a partner.
And Aiyana? She found, post-trial, that her power had become a practical thing. A deed filed in her name for the small house that had been a refuge. The magistrate, in a small act of deferred justice, offered her an official place in the register, a formal recognition that her place existed. The deed was not an empty paper. It was a statement that a woman, Apache, a healer, a widow, could hold property and be recognized by law in a place where men once wrote the rules for everything. The victory was not a clean end. Finch's arrogance had been curtailed, but the rot of systemic abuse was not wiped away in a day. Other men still thought they could take what they wanted, but the precedent mattered. Women learned they had options. They could call witnesses, they could write, they could hold men accountable. The town, now in the slow process of healing, moved with new caution and new resolve. Aiyana and Cole chose not to make their relationship a sensational story for gossip. They married, quietly, in a way that honored both cultures. She wore a small braid in her hair, and he wore a plain ring. The ceremony was not the end of her story. It was a practical alliance, a partnership built on the equality they had sworn to maintain. They ran a clinic together, and soon that clinic grew into something larger. Shelves of jars labeled with Apache and settler names, a registry of people who had been wronged, and a small bench where women wrote their claims. It was a practical victory, grounded in law and love. 5 years later, the Healing Lodge at the bend of the river looked different. It had a porch with a sign carved by Cole, plain letters, sturdy as a promise, and a garden that bloomed with plants both native and foreign. Sage, willow, lavender, an old apple tree that Maria had grafted with the steadiness of a woman who knows how to build things that last. The floorboard under Aiyana's bed still held a small cache, but now it also held paper deeds and care notes for apprentices. The cabin had become a hub, a place where women from miles around came not simply for remedies, but for counsel, and to learn how to file a claim. Aiyana was 38 when the story began. She was 43 now, and the lines in her face had changed from grief to a different kind of map. Her hair carried a few silver threads that the sunlight liked to catch, and she wore her medicine bag at her hip as much as a symbol of identity as a tool. Her clothing had shifted from the grieving garments of the early winters to practical mixes of flax and painted beadwork, a wardrobe that spoke of resilience rather than ritual. She had students, young women apprenticed in rudimentary medicine, a midwife from the next valley who wanted to learn the art of the poultice, and a thin-boned girl who liked to sit near the jars and name every cent. The women who had stood with her in the courtroom often passed through, bringing meals or sewing a patch on a coat. Female solidarity manifested in a daily rhythm, a morning circle where women shared news, a midday story session where older women taught younger ones how to read a ledger, and an evening when they bartered skills over tea. Cole ran the trading post that had been added onto the lodge, quiet, efficient, and humble. He kept ledgers for the community, not for personal gain, and ensured that the receipts that left his hand were transparent. People trusted the trading post because it was more than commerce. It was a visible commitment to fairness. Cole had become a man who wore his past like a shadow that informed his choices rather than a chain. He was still rough-handed and direct, but his edges were softened by an ethic learned from a woman who refused to let the world reduce love to rescue. Their romance had matured into something deliberate and companionable. They did not perform devotion as a spectacle. They practiced it in the everyday acts that build lives. Watching the garden grow, arguing over which herb would cure a wayward child's cough, choosing whether to open the lodge's doors to a traveling family, they made decisions together. She listened when he worried about heavy-handed neighbors. He asked counsel when a young man sought guidance before taking a life. Their partnership of equals was visible, and that visibility was powerful. Her power had evolved. She had financial independence not just as a token, but as a resource that allowed her to grant loans to women who wanted to buy their own plots of land. She had property whose deed bore her name and the imprint of a court that acknowledged it. She helped draft the first simple charter outlining women's right to property in their small valley. It was not a sweeping legal revolution, but a start. The women who came to her found in Aiyana someone who had navigated grief and emerged with tools to offer them a different kind of future. Her transformation was more than external. Inside, she had traded the brittle hope of revenge for the durable satisfaction of justice served in public and in practice. The lodge had become her instrument, a place where grief was listened to and then used as the blueprint for action. Her voice had become the voice that other women listened to when they wanted to learn how to be loud and correct without violence. On a warm afternoon when the river cottoned with new sap and the children ran with bare feet in the dust, Aiyana stood on her porch and watched a group of girls plant seeds in the garden. She ran a hand over the locket at her throat, still silver, still a reminder of what she lost, and then looked up to see Cole coming with a basket of bread. Their eyes met. There was a brevity in that look, a shorthand that had grown over years of shared weather. They had both changed. She had become authoritative without becoming harsh. He had become steady without losing his capacity for mischief. They had built a life that made a small corner of the world better, one patient and one ledger at a time. Women came to her not just for cures, but for training in how to hold a line at the town council, how to secure a deed, how to tell their truth in a courtroom without being swallowed. A tiny girl, one of the apprentices, ran up to ask about a curative for a scraped knee. Aiyana showed her how to bind it. Then Maria, Ruth, and Nanatashi joined them, and the circle grew to include women from all the valley's different backgrounds. They talked of crops and court dates, midwives and markets. The lodge hummed with life. Her story, once defined by loss, had become a narrative of restoration and agency. Aiyana, who had once been given the choice to be quiet, now headed a movement where silence had been replaced by documented justice and an economy that favored the fair. The woman who had been advised to move on now wrote instructions for other women on what it meant to stay and fight for something better. And somewhere not far away, Lieutenant Finch had been stripped of command and had to answer to men in his own world for what he had done. His name was a cautionary tale told to young soldiers who found themselves tempted to treat authority as armor. He was not erased. He paid the legal price, which in the end was a small mercy for those he had harmed. She had not been saved by love. She had chosen a partner and found in him a companion who matched her stride. He had not completed her, nor had she softened him into a lesser man. Rather, they were two people who learned how to make one another better. Where she was tactical and tender, he was strategic and soulful. Together they kept the lodge, tending people's hurts while tending the law. Finally, on a clear evening, after supper and after tending a child with a fever, Aiyana sat with her hands in her lap and watched the horizon. The stars were indifferent and steady in their scattering. She thought of the line of women who had stood beside her, who had been the muscle and the map when courage mattered. She thought of the ledger that had been a weapon and had since been transformed into a tool of fairness. Her life had been remade. She had become the force she had always been capable of becoming, a healer who could wield law like a scalpel, a leader who could hold fury like breath, a woman who had turned rupture into reconstruction. She had chosen everything on her terms. She had not been defined by loss. She had made a future. And now, sister, this is where the story invites you in. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe that it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you've found your tribe. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings. Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms. Share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister. Because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are.